Okay, so this happened to me back in September, and since I was able to finally piece some things together, I can't stop talking about it, so I want to share it with you too. Autumn is my favorite time of year. I love the cooler air. I love pulling out all of my sweaters, boots, and scarves. I love decorating with various leaves, garland, and gourds. Yes, I am that girl. And I'm okay with it because it puts me in an incredible mood. And to add to such a lovely time of year, I love the pumpkin spice and praline coffees that come out of hiding. I had an extra day off during the week as a required PTO day, and for once, I had nothing to do. I was caught up with chores, no appointments or meetings, so I told myself that I deserved an actual mental health day. I slept in a little, and after a shower, I decided that I would enjoy one of my favorite coffees at my favorite little cafe. When I arrived, I talked to one of the baristas there. She was still in college and always tells me how she's doing in it. After chatting for a bit, I found myself a seat in one of their big armchairs that I wish I could fit into my apartment. I pulled out my Kindle and earbuds and got myself settled in to read for a few hours, something I hadn't been able to do in a few months. I was pretty lost in my book, completely unaware of my surroundings for a few hours, until I started getting this weird, unsettling feeling. It started as an inexplicable sensation that somebody was watching me, but I just brushed it off as me being paranoid. Or the book. The book that I was reading was a thriller about someone being stalked, so it would make sense. However, I stopped reading to respond to a text that I'd received, which resulted in me checking social media, which then made me realize that same feeling was still lingering. So I did what anyone else would do, and looked up to see if the feeling was warranted. Unfortunately, it was. I scanned the lobby until I locked on to the line of people waiting to place their order. There was a man standing in line, but he was standing slightly askew from the others, and was staring right at me. His face looked relaxed. He didn't look upset, overly unhappy, or even focusing on me, like he was trying to recognize me. But when we made eye contact, he smiled at me and softly nodded. I didn't recognize him, so I just smiled back and looked down at my phone, hoping maybe it was just an awkward moment. Afterwards, I went back to my Kindle, hoping to finish my book before I left. I tried not to make it obvious, but when the feeling persisted, I wanted to check if he was still looking at me. I would take a sip of my coffee and look back over towards the line, and would see him looking over his shoulder at me. Finally, he would stop staring long enough to actually place his orders, so I went back to my book, hoping that he would soon leave and I wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. I was in a good chapter of the book, so I held on to that, hoping I could just get lost in it again and not even notice when he left. But that wasn't his plan, I guess. As I read, the light above me seemed to darken, and I looked up to see the same man sit in the armchair next to me. I didn't know at the time what his intentions were. Was he going to try to talk to me? Did he recognize me from somewhere? Or was he just one of those weird people that feel the need to sit near somebody who obviously wants to be left alone? Regardless of which one it was, I wasn't interested. So, with my plans being interrupted, I took out my earbuds and started putting everything in my bag so that I could leave. But as soon as I took my earbuds out, this man waved at me, like he was trying to get my attention. I look over at him, and I raise my eyebrows in a "can I help you" kind of way. "I know you," he said softly but confidently. I didn't know how to respond to that. Sure, some people may recognize you or think they do, but they may also follow up with how they may know you. Like, "Oh, did you go to X school, or did you ever work at X?" and things like that. But instead, he made that comment and just waited for me to respond. And the look on his face and that smile, it really didn't seem friendly. It seemed more like a, I know something you don't know kind of smile. And I did not like it, nor the feeling that it was giving me. I'm sorry, I don't recognize you at all. Do I know you from somewhere? Before I could think of a more detailed question to ascertain how he knew me, he broke the silence. And in that same consistent calm and quiet tone, he said, I found you. While his smile turned into something a bit more sinister. I didn't know what to say to that. We again sat there silently, but this time the man stood up and left. He even left behind his coffee. Now that I was confused and kind of spooked, I went ahead and left, looking all around as I walked to my car and got in, locking the doors immediately. Who was that guy? And how the hell did he know me? And what did he mean by found you? It seemed so random but cryptic, and definitely cemented that feeling of paranoia. I went home and told my friends about it, and even wrote about it in my daily journal. I still had no explanation for his weird comment, though. My friend said that he was probably just being a jerk and wanted to play a prank on someone, and since I paid attention, he chose me. Or maybe he was caught staring at me and he needed to think of a reason. These both seemed reasonable, and were definitely more innocent than what it first appeared to be, so I agreed and just let it go. I still even stopped by the cafe on plenty of occasions to get my caffeine fix, and I never saw the guy again. In fact, it wasn't until last month that it finally came back around. I'd been having a bit of a recurring nightmare for several months that seemed to start after I had oral surgery. In this nightmare, I was constantly running through a dark, ominous forest. I remember I was always barefoot and had on a thin dress or maybe a nightgown. I just remembered that I never had bottoms on and recall feeling the cold air rush through my dress and touch my bare skin. I was always freezing. Whether I had this dream in the summer or around now in the autumn, I was always freezing. I also know that I was terrified, looking around as I ran. It was like I was running from something or someone. Then the dream would always end the same way. I would feel someone grab my arm and hear them say, "Found you." Then the feeling of being grabbed would always wake me up. I had this nightmare a few times a month, and I hadn't had it for about a week at the time of my day off, so I didn't even think about it. But then I had this nightmare again, and the next morning while I made my coffee at home, I remembered the guy from the cafe and nearly had a panic attack. Could they possibly be related? Was it just a coincidence that the guy said this to me, knowing that it would be relevant to this dream that I kept having? Or was there something more to it? I never talked to anyone about my dream in an online forum. I told one of my close friends about it, my mom and my therapist. And that was it. It was personal, and I'd been through some things, so I was cautious of who I opened up to. There's no way that I could possibly think of that this man had any knowledge of my dream. But the question still lingers in my mind rent-free. Why would he say that? And why would he say it to me? Was there something he knew that I didn't? Or was it truly just a coincidence in a dumb prank? I even sat up at the cafe one day over the weekend, thinking I might catch this guy again, but I have yet to see him again, 2 months later. I wish there was a way that I could find this guy and ask him about it, because it really does bother me. I told my therapist about it too, who has also helped me work through it, but in the meantime, it's still an unanswered question. and it's one that I will probably always have. Back whenever I was around 19, so quite a while ago, I used to sling fries at a place that I don't want to name specifically, so we're just gonna call it McBurger Queen. It was a fast food job, one that had me working around grease and oil for literally 6 hours a day. It was gross, slippery, and terrible for both my weight and my skin. For a broke college student that was doing their best, it was a paycheck, and nothing else. I hated every minute of it, but I did it long enough to be promoted once or twice, all the way up to a shift lead. Not a manager per se, but a lead. It meant that I had to delegate things while the managers sat on their back ends in the office. And that said, it did pay for what I needed it to pay for, and as much as I loathed it, I kept it and tried my best to just get through it. Then came who I'll just call Mr. Creepshow. At first, he was just another 50-something overweight guy that liked to come in on Fridays, a slightly chubby dude with a taste for a double cheeseburger meal. At first, I hardly noticed him, but even when you don't work front, certain orders start to ring a bell. Double cheeseburger, no ketchup, add mayonnaise, extra pickle, and large, unsalted fries. Yes, I still remember what he would order, because after a while it was an order that I would come to hate. But initially it was just basic stuff. He'd come in, order, I'd get his food made and out onto the counter. It went from once a week to a few times a week, to literally every single shift that I worked. He went from ordering and sitting down, to ordering and then standing at the counter watching me make his food with this awkward grin on his face. When he sat down, he would sit at the closest table and would just stare as he ate. Innocent, yet creepy as hell. And then he started trying to talk to me. I would walk an order up, and he would be at the counter and try to get my attention. It would always start with him saying something was wrong with his order and ask that I fix it. But he would then try to squeeze in small talk about anything and everything. The weather, how my schooling was going. I made the mistake of once telling him that I was going to college. How work was going. Then the conversation started to swing towards things that he had no business asking. Not as a customer at a burger joint that I barely knew. One day, he asked me to come up to the counter and he didn't have his food, so I didn't know what he was going to bother me with. I walked up, asked if I could help him, and he said, "Yeah, you can. I'd like to take you out for coffee sometime. Would you like that?" The way he asked it was so weird. Ending the sentence with, "Would you like that?" was such an awkward way to ask someone out. I told him that I appreciated the gesture, but that I was taken. He laughed and said something like, "Oh, that's fine. I'm sure you have a bunch of guys after you with, assets like that." I stared at him for a moment, and he seriously gave me the elevator eyes and smirked at me. At that point, I told him that he was making me feel really uncomfortable. He then responded with, "How about I take you home and make you feel even more uncomfortable?" I stepped back and told him in no uncertain words that what he was saying was not okay, and that I was going back to work, and that the conversation was over. After that shift was over, I spilled everything to my night manager, who gave me the go-ahead to boot Mr. Creepshow if he tried to talk to me about anything inappropriate again. But that was it. And she didn't ask any questions, didn't ask for his name or what he looked like. She just said that it was my responsibility to take care of it until or unless he physically did something inappropriate. After that, I didn't see Mr. Creepshow for a week, so I thought that it was over, and that he had gotten the hint. Maybe he'd moved on to haunt some other poor girl in another fast food establishment. But then, when I walked into work one night, there he was. He was standing in the McBurger Queen manager's office, except he was in uniform. My stomach dropped as my night manager introduced him to me as David, and said that he was a new crew member, my new coworker. I just gave a plastic smile and asked if I could talk to her alone, and she sent him off to the front to get used to things up there. I then told her that he was the guy, that he was the creep that I had told her about. She gave me this look that screamed that she didn't believe me at all, and dismissively said, "No, you must be mistaken. David seems like an alright guy." I shook my head, and I told her that it was either him or me. That he had to go, or that I was going to go. She promised that she would work something out, and that I needed to just try to work with him. For a few days, I had to work with this guy, and I could just feel him staring at me. And of course, he worked every shift that I was working. Then, my manager told me that she had actually worked it out with our sister store to transfer him to their team, as they had more openings than we did. But, and of course there was a but, since he had applied and wanted to work at this location, if he wanted to come back here, he could make a call to corporate, and they would likely transfer him back. Basically, if Mr. Creepshow wanted to come back and ogle me some more, he was within his rights to do so as a McBurger Queen employee. So, I went ahead and gave her my 2 weeks' notice right then and there, and told her that him being away temporarily was not enough for me. She was disappointed, but she said that she understood. I just kept my head down and counted my shifts until it was my last one. On my second to last day, who would show up working at our store again but Mr. Creepshow? When he clocked in, he walked back to my station and said something like, "So, I heard you're leaving. Can I go ahead and get your number now? I want to get to know you better. See what you've got going on." Again, he was giving me those sleazy elevator eyes. I snapped. I told him that I would rather dip my face in the fryer than ever see his face again. He just kept this big grin and watched me as I walked away from him to turn in my cap and name badge. I dropped them off and I walked straight out that door. I did go back one time just to get my paycheck, and the whole time he was out mopping the lobby and was just staring at me. He gave me this gross little wave and a kissy face when I saw him, and I gave him the finger. After that, I never went back to that location. I've barely gone back to that specific chain of restaurants, and I hope more than anything that Mr. Creepshow choked on every chicken nugget he ate after that day. I've only ever had one experience with anything paranormal. And prior to this, I was not what you would call a believer. In fact, I would say I was a skeptic. And I know that people will say something like, "How can you be a skeptic with all the evidence or proof?" But honestly, I've seen enough people making arguments for obviously fake BS that it's hard not to be skeptical. I find the stories and experiences that you see on TV to be fun, but not much more than that. And I will honestly say that I still am very skeptical of a lot of the experiences you see on those shows. But I'm much less skeptical about the experiences I've read online or heard in podcasts. About 10 years ago, I started working for a company whose name I'm not really supposed to mention. I can describe it and give it a fake name, but there are reasons that I'm not supposed to mention the name of the company, which may be obvious to some. So let's just say that I worked for a company called the Data Factory, or DF for short. DF is a very large data center that services a lot of high priority organizations. And while I may not be a tech person, I understand that they are the backbone of a lot of commerce and online presences. DF was built in an old factory that had been shut down and was then repurposed. And it's kind of wedged between a town that no one lives in and a large section of woods and cave systems. More or less, we are in the core of middle of nowhere. And we have several direct fiber optic lines to a very large service provider. It's kind of neat the more you think about it. I was hired on as a security guard at DF through a third-party company, and I was brought in on the overnight shift. I've worked this shift for the entire 10 years that I've worked there, and I think I'm the second most senior guard on the team, and the most senior guard on the night shift. It's a pretty straightforward job. Like I said, it's very middle of nowhere, so we don't have a lot to do, but we still have to keep our eyes peeled. The event that this story is about actually happened in my first year, about 2 or 3 months into my working there. It was a pretty normal night, around 2 in the morning, as that's when I went to my first break. I was walking through the main floor of the data center from the guard post to the break room, thinking that I really needed some coffee if I was going to make it through the whole shift. I was about halfway there when I heard what sounded like someone talking. I jumped. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it in the direction of where I thought it was coming from. I called out, asking who was there, and slowly walked toward the back section of the data center. I paused for a moment, listening to see if I could hear anything more to get a better feel for what I was hearing, but there was nothing. I went ahead and called it in to one of the other guards, mentioned that I thought I heard talking on the main floor, and asked them to go ahead and do rounds to make sure that it was nothing. They went to do their rounds, and I continued to go to my break. When I got to the break room, I got my coffee and was sitting there just mindlessly staring at the floor and waiting for the 20 minutes to pass, when I heard another sound. This time it wasn't just a voice. It sounded like somebody yelling. My immediate thought was that it was one of the guards and that they had found someone in the building. I jumped up and ran out to where it sounded like the yelling was coming from, but once again was met with nothing. I grabbed the radio and asked for a check-in, asking if someone found someone, and all of them told me that their rounds came up empty. I asked if anyone had yelled at some point or if they'd heard yelling, and once again, nothing. None of them had heard anything, nor had any of them made any noise. I mentioned that I thought I heard someone, and one of the guards laughed, saying that I must have just been losing my mind. I went back to my coffee, finished it off, and then went back to the station, and just told them that it was really weird and that I swear I was hearing things. They told me again that they did the rounds and that there was nothing on the floor, and that they didn't hear anything at all. As if on cue, when my coworker was saying that he hadn't heard anything, he was cut off by what sounded again like somebody yelling. This time it was less just yelling and more a mix of agonized screaming and crying in pain. I watched as he went completely pale and realized that this time he had heard the sound. I told him that that was close to what I was hearing, and he just sort of nodded like, okay, yeah, that's a thing. I asked him if we should go check it out, and while he wanted to say no, he said that we did need to go at least have a look. We headed to the room where we'd heard the sound coming from and both checked the whole floor. There was nothing. We met back up after checking the whole area, and both reported that there wasn't anything there. When we went back to the guard post, we both kind of did what we could to shake it all off, and he made a joke about how if I was going crazy, then so was he, because he definitely heard the sounds too. Then, after a few moments of us calming down, sitting there in silence, I looked up and I swear I saw what looked like an amorphous shadow just standing in the corner of the building, watching us. When I saw it, the hair on my arms stood straight up and I swear my heart started racing, like I was reacting to seeing this thing. I guess I must have went pale too, because my coworker asked if I was about to pass out. I just told him that I saw something and just left it at that. The rest of the night was actually uneventful. Since then, we've had a few nights where we've heard talking on the floors, but nothing anywhere near as crazy as the screaming of that night. It's kind of become a running joke about the voices in the data center, but that first night was genuinely terrifying. I'm the only one that has ever seen the shadow, much to my disappointment, as that would have added a lot of proof to my story. But it is what it is. Hey Raven, I wanted to share the story with you and your audience, as it's one of those stories that is creepy, but can also be used as educational, as you always say. It's one of the only times I've ever felt scared for my life, honestly. And it's been a few years now, and thankfully nothing else has happened, minus this one event. To start, it was a pretty good night. I'd gone out with a couple of friends. I hadn't been drinking or anything. We had just been out having dinner as a small group and went out to see a movie. It was a bit of a silly night, but it was a good time. I wanted to stay the night with them all, as they were staying at one of their houses, but I had to work in the morning, so I unfortunately had to drive home after we were all done with the night's events. I was in pretty high spirits on the drive home, though. I had my windows down, my music was up, and I was breathing in the night air. It wasn't a terribly far drive, like half an hour or so I was just coasting on autopilot through most of it. I assumed it would be uneventful, until I was heading down one road about 10 minutes from my house. I was driving as I had been, and down one of the side roads, there was a car that was going the opposite direction. Nothing scary about that. People drive on roads. They passed me, and after they did, I happened to glance up into my rearview mirror for whatever reason, and I watched them slam their brakes and start into a K-turn. Then, they got behind me. Now, I thought that maybe they had intentions on doing this anyways, and it was just bad timing or something, but they sped up pretty quickly to get behind me, which was a tad alarming. After a couple seconds of them driving behind me, they kicked on their flashing lights and my stomach dropped. I looked down at my speedometer. I wasn't speeding. I hadn't done anything stupid or illegal as far back as I could remember. My headlights were all in working order. I had no idea why they would be pulling me over. I thought about the situation for a moment, and even started preparing myself to pull over at the first available shoulder. The road that I was on didn't have a shoulder, so I couldn't have pulled over there. After thinking about why I would be being pulled over, something clicked in my head. Specifically about the car. I didn't see any markings on the car that indicated it was a cop car. The tag that I saw as it passed was not a government tag, which is required on unmarked vehicles. Plus, the unmarked cars where I live are usually SUVs, which this was not. As I started piecing the thoughts together and thinking about the whole thing, I realized something else. The light that was flashing was just a single blue light, and it looked like it was on his dashboard. My state uses full light bars, blue, white, and red, and they're typically on top of the cars. I think that this was even implemented as a requirement at some point, but I can't say for sure. As all of these pieces started falling into place, it occurred to me what this was, most likely. It was not an actual officer. With how the light was set up, the lack of markings, this was an impersonator, and they were trying to pull me over for God knows what nefarious reason. At this point, I decided I would take a chance. I figured that I would drive to the police station, and if this was a real officer, they would just tack on a possible evading charge that I would of course fight. And it was going to suck if they were real, but I was pretty certain that they weren't. I kept on down the road, and they kept on tailgating me, and we made a few turns through the town. The person kept right at my bumper, and they kept the light on the whole time. The further we drove, the more I was absolutely convinced this was a fake. Not once did he go over the speaker saying to pull over. Not once did he hit a siren. He did hit his horn a few times, but that was even more suspicious. I kept on going for a while until I was close to the police station. I turned down the road that the police station was on, and then hit my signal to indicate that I was pulling into the parking lot of said station. As soon as I hit my signal, he got over into the oncoming lane and took off down the road past me, going way too fast down the road, and obviously trying to make a break for it. There was an officer that was outside the station just getting out of his cruiser that saw the whole thing happen. When I pulled in, he ran over to me and asked me a couple of questions about the car. I told him a really quick summary of what had happened. He told me to go in and let the front desk know the situation so they could get a report, and he jumped back in his cruiser, taking off with lights and sirens going. I did what he asked. I went in and told the officer at the desk that I was followed by someone pretending to be a cop. He took my statement very seriously, thankfully, and I heard him get on the radio to the officer that had taken off after him. I then made a formal statement, detailing all that I could remember about the car, the location where he started following me, what I was doing, etc. After a while, the original officer came back to the station and I spoke with him about it too. He, unfortunately, was not able to find him, but he told me that he got a good look at the car and confirmed my statement as being what he saw too. He also told me that I did the right thing, that me going to the station instead of stopping may have literally saved my life. He also informed me that, in cases like this, where I think it may be an impersonator, that I should dial 911 and confirm that the officer is legitimate, and that the dispatcher will have all the information to confirm it. So, this was an educational situation for me. One that was terrifying because I almost did stop. If he'd been a bit more convincing with his props, specifically the light, I likely would have, because I wouldn't have thought twice. Hopefully the story can help someone out there to avoid any situation like the one I was in. I know that most officers out there may take offense to you not stopping right away, but if you aren't feeling safe, you should at least call 911 to confirm that you are being pulled over by someone legitimate. Of course, if you're being followed by a fully marked cruiser with full light bars and sirens, odds are it's legitimate, and you probably shouldn't push your luck. Either way, that's my story, and it's one that has stuck with me for these past couple of years, because it really was scary how close I was to something that was potentially incredibly dangerous. So, I have a story that I wanted to tell, and because my actions were a bit severe, and they probably would have landed me in jail had there not been a camera that caught literally the entire interaction. We'll get to that. But to start, I want to explain who I am. My name is Julian, and I'm not a very large man. I am, to put it lightly, a bit flamboyant. And I've been targeted for this in the past. Mostly just hateful words and such, but at least one other time, I was attacked because of who I am. Unfortunately, that event left me with a bit of PTSD, and because of this, I think I did overreact when this recent situation happened. But at the same time, my actions were deemed legally justified. This happened on a fairly routine Friday for me, at least work-wise. I work at a local tech shop, one that does phone repairs and sells various accessories and such. On this particular Friday, I was a closer, and my roommate was supposed to come pick me up. I ended up closing at normal with my boss, and after we were done, he asked me if I had a ride home. I told him that I did, that my roommate was going to come get me, and he asked if I wanted him to stay until he showed up. I stupidly told him not to worry about it, that my roommate was probably just a few minutes late, and that they'd be there any minute. He went ahead and left, and I was just standing there waiting for a few more minutes before I called my roommate. When he answered, I could tell that he wasn't at home, and he asked me what was up. I asked him where the hell he was, and I could hear it click that he'd forgotten that he was my ride. Come to find out, he was at a party and was about 3 drinks deep. I angrily ended the call and just stood there thinking, great, now I have to walk home. It wasn't a crazy far walk, but it wasn't one that I was wanting to do that late at night. I didn't really have much of a choice, as I didn't have money to pay for an Uber right then, so I just bucked up and started walking home. I started making my way out into the parking lot when I watched a van drive down the road just outside the lot at a super slow speed. They were going at a normal speed, got out front of the shop, and then slowed down and kept on going. I thought it was weird, but just shrugged it off, thinking they were looking for something. Until I saw them hit a U-turn at the next intersection, drive back past the strip mall where our shop was, and then turn into the parking lot. I just stood there like an idiot watching them pull in, and then slowly pull up just past where I was standing. As soon as the car parked about 5 feet to my right, I watched as this scraggly-looking man threw the driver's door open and started walking back towards where I was. As he did, he said, "Hey, are you okay?" I was a bit confused, like, yeah, why wouldn't I be? I told him as such, and he laughed and then said, "What are you doing out here all alone then?" I'm not gonna lie, this was such a weird interaction. This guy got out and just started hitting me with these weird questions, and I was just answering them with short responses like this was totally normal. It was absolutely not normal, and I don't know why it didn't really click at the time that something was up, but it didn't. It clicked really about 30 seconds after his last question, when he reached out and grabbed my wrist and said something like, "Why don't you get in the van? I'll take you home." I still just kind of stood there looking at him like I was offended, and said something like, "No, thank you, I'll walk." He then started mumbling something to himself for a moment before shouting, "I have a gun, and if you don't get in the van, I'm gonna effing kill you." There was obviously no way in hell I was going to get into that van, and I was pretty sure that if I did, he was going to kill me anyways. So I tried to pull away from him, telling him that I was not going with him. This is where the adrenaline kicked in, and things went sideways. As I tried to pull away, he started pulling me harder, and trying to position himself to grab me and push me in the van. My mind then went into overdrive, as I realized what was about to happen. I grabbed my keys out of my pocket, putting them between my fingers, and I punched him square in the eye. He pulled back, screaming in agony. I could see the blood on his face, but at this point I really didn't care if I'd hurt him. I ran back to the front of the store, unlocked it, and then relocked it behind me and immediately called the police. I told them that some random guy had just tried to attack me. They asked where he was at that point in time, and I informed them that he was lying on the ground screaming in agony just outside the store. The dispatcher seemed a bit confused by that statement, but I informed him that I had defended myself when he tried to grab me, and that I may have injured him in the process. The cops arrived, as did an ambulance, and they did end up taking him to the hospital, as I had apparently done some very real damage. I had to talk to the police for a long time. I ended up calling my manager back in so that he could show them the footage from the front door cameras, and thankfully, right there, caught in 1080p, was proof that this guy had tried to abduct me, and that me hitting him was my attempt to get away. I feel like the officers wanted to chastise me for messing him up like I had, but for me, this was life or death. I was fully aware of what would likely happen if I had let him take me. Thankfully, he went into lockup for whatever they charged him with, and I'm about 99% certain that he lost the use of that eye. But in the end, that was the price he paid for his actions, and I do not regret it. If I'd gotten in that van, willingly or unwillingly, I promise you that I would not be around to write this post. Did I overdo it? Maybe. But I only hit him the one time. And yes, I did use a key and I did hit him in the eye, but I did this to defend myself. And if put in this situation again, I would absolutely do it again in a heartbeat if I had to. I used to work at a fairly popular coffee chain in my early 20s. It wasn't like the Green Mermaid coffee place popular, but it was a pretty big one in my state, nonetheless. I only worked there for a few years, though, because the back end of it was not nearly as fun and enjoyable as their coffee. If I may, don't get a job at a place that you love being a customer at. It may ruin your opinion of the place. Anyways, the job started out great. The benefits were pretty good considering the job, same with the pay. Some of the policies were a bit strange, maybe even unnecessary, but they were manageable. I even had some normal customers that I enjoyed seeing, and then there were some that you hoped that you would just never see again. One of those customers was this guy that we only knew as Willie. That's what he introduced himself as, and what he always had written on his cup. He was in his 50s. I know this because he liked to make comments like, "I've seen and heard a lot of things in my 50 years," and other similar things. He also made comments to a lot of our younger staff, including me, that he was old enough to be our dads. So, like I said, Willie was always friendly with us all, and while some of his comments started as just being cringy or cliche, he didn't initially seem like a bad guy. But then he started to get too comfortable with us. He would make jokes with the male baristas and thank them for his order, but when it came to the female employees, he took it a step further, attempting to be flirtatious. It was never overtly explicit, just uncomfortably tame, conveniently always leaving management with no grounds to intervene. Their stance was always clear. Unless he crossed a line, made threats, or engaged in truly inappropriate behavior, they couldn't, or more like wouldn't, take action. So, we all dealt with it. We were put in a grin and bear it kind of situation, and most days that's what we did. Sometimes some of us girls that he seemed to favor would hide in the back until he left, but that wasn't always an option. He would sometimes come in the middle of a rush, leaving us trapped. We would stand at the register as he very obviously stared at our chests. I don't know if he didn't care or if he really thought he was being sneaky, but we all noticed. He made me rethink how we dressed under our aprons. The uniform was pretty laxed, black or tan pants and a single plain colored shirt. Our apron had the store names on them, colors, and our first name on it, so they just told us to keep it simple. I started wearing baggier clothing and even sweaters under my apron. His looks alone chipped away at our comfort. He even made comments to some of the male baristas about us. One of those times was about me, but I was on the other end of the bar helping another customer, so I didn't hear him at the time. Apparently what he had said was undeniably inappropriate and left the barista visibly uncomfortable. When I happened to look in their direction, I could see how red his face was, and the obviously fake smile he had plastered on his face. He later confirmed to me that Willie did make a comment about me, but that he didn't want to repeat it. That told me all that I needed to know. I once again told one of the managers, and they said that they would look into it, but the barista said he was never approached about it either. It was obvious that this guy didn't care how he made other people feel, and that he was pretty much getting away with it. Then came the day that it all boiled over. I was out on the floor at the self-serve drink station, refilling the creamer carafe and the sugar packets. It was right after the lunch rush, so I wanted to take the chance to clean up the lobby before our last evening rush came in. I was slightly leaning over a small table to grab the straw container in the back when I felt someone's arm wrap around my waist and quickly make their way up. I didn't know who it was at first, until they spoke, once again making a disgusting comment. It all happened so fast. My heart raced and my reflexes kicked in, causing me to swing my arms back in defense, making Willie let go. When I turned around, there he was, giggling like a child and smiling like he had just played some harmless prank. My anger surged, and I yelled at him. "What the hell is wrong with you? What makes you think that is okay?" But instead of remorse, he laughed and commented, "Oh, come on. Everyone needs a hug now and then, right?" I felt embarrassed, violated, and I was seething with anger that it was ever able to even get this far. I took off towards the back to get the manager, still spouting things off to him as I walked. Jean was behind the counter at the time, but in my soured mood, I didn't even notice him at first. By the time I'd gotten back behind the counter, the manager had already come to the front and asked what was going on. I explained everything to him as Willie continued to give his order to Jean, who looked like he didn't know if he should continue with taking it. We both looked over at Jean when I mentioned him seeing everything, and he confirmed that he did. Willie again threw his hands in the air, claiming that he didn't mean anything by it and laughing. His laugh used to just annoy me, but that day, it pissed me off. He really thought that what he did was okay, and not once did he ever apologize. But what made it worse was when the manager, Carol, looked at me, annoyed. Like I was the problem. Like I was being dramatic. So I told her that if she didn't do something about him now, I was leaving. She looked at him and asked if he got his drink yet, telling me all that I needed to know. I grabbed my stuff from the back and walked out of the store. I couldn't afford to quit, but I wasn't going to stay in a place where I wasn't respected. So I left. When I got home, I shared the whole ordeal with my boyfriend, who was equally as livid as I was. Together, we came up with a plan. I called Jean, who was more than willing to make a statement. My boyfriend drove me back to the shop the next day, because, yes, they called me to ask if I would be in the next day, and I worked the day as normal. Surprisingly, Willie never showed up. Well, that day at least. But he did the next day. And when the manager wouldn't make him leave, then I would. I would drop everything that I was doing and just walk out. To be honest, I'm surprised they didn't fire me, but I guess that tells me that they were hurting for people more. I went through this for about a week, maybe a little less, and I ended up leaving early 4 times in that week. Then, my restraining order papers went through, and I was told that he was served the papers too. I was hoping that it would just be all over there, but to my surprise, he showed up at my work. At that point, I had more control though. I called the police immediately, and I was surprised at how quickly they showed up. He was reminded of the restraining order and was told to leave, and for the first time I saw the other side of Willie. His face became red and he started yelling. He yelled at the cops. He yelled at the customers about how much of a liar I was. He yelled at me for leading him on. The officer finally got him out of the building where his shouting continued. I tried to ignore it and help the customer in front of me, but the customers sitting at the table near the window were now standing and looking out the windows, talking, and pulling out their phones. By then, most of the people in the shop were starting to look outside and trying to see what was happening. Once things started settling down, my boyfriend, who had showed up after I called the cops, came in and told me what he saw, which aligned with the things I heard from a few customers. He arrived after the cops and saw them both walking out. Willie was yelling at the cop and mentioned something about a gun. The cop had his hand on his belt and watched to make sure that he got in his car to leave. However, Willie instead grabbed something that my boyfriend couldn't see, but when he started raising his arm, the cop tased him and he dropped him immediately. Willie did indeed have a gun in his truck, so when all he had to do was leave the shop, he was now sitting in a cruiser after threatening a police officer. I never saw Willie again, but that's probably obvious. I'm not sure what, if anything, he was charged with, but I guess it must have either finally clicked in his head, or he was behind bars because I never saw him again. I only worked there for about another month, though, as I could not deal with management. While they never said it, I feel like they, or at least Carol, thought that it was my fault. She was very dismissive with me, or would tiptoe around everything, like she was worried that I would report her or something. I wasn't going to tolerate Willie's actions, so I wasn't going to tolerate retaliation. I'm much happier with where I am now, and management takes that kind of stuff very seriously, and I'm grateful for that. I just wanted to share my experience because it did start out pretty tame. While still inappropriate, that's what it was, and I probably could have just dealt with the comments. But when it got physical, I knew that I needed to put my foot down. And yet, it escalated to possible violence. The fact that he was willing to do that to a cop honestly scares me, because what would he have done if he caught me as I was leaving? Or coming in? So, just a reminder, set your own boundaries, and don't let anyone bend them. Oh, and don't be afraid to call someone out and get help. I grew up in a very loving, yet unique household. At least, in my opinion. I was adopted, but many people would say that it was a weird time for my parents to do so. They're pretty well set in life. My father owns an accounting firm that was passed down to him by my grandfather, and my mom became part of that family and embraced it well. They adopted me when I was 3, and I know people have made many comments about it to them, and to me, because they adopted me when they were in their 50s. This was not a situation of a kid or a family member having a child that they couldn't take care of either. They went through all the legal motions to adopt a kid, and even mentioned how they had some difficulties due to their age. But eventually, they won, and I'm forever grateful for that. But I also wasn't the only child. They have a son, a biological son, named Danny, and there was a 15-year difference between us. When they were going through the motions of adoption, my brother, their son, had just graduated from high school. He was still living at home and wasn't attending college, as he was still trying to decide what he wanted to do. So while I did get to know him as I grew up, we weren't close enough to really play together or bond. It was like he was another adult or family member, but nonetheless, I still treated him like my brother and called him as such, because he was all I had. However, he did not seem to feel the same about me. While he didn't outwardly express it to me, he made it obvious to my parents, and I eventually heard about it as I got older. Unfortunately, that's how this story came to be. My parents truly did treat us equally. They supported us both, celebrated our accomplishments, grieved with us when we were upset, and even both got in trouble for the bad things, even though he was a young adult. He was still living under their roof, after all. However, I could always feel a sense of anger or jealousy from Danny. He never wanted to attend any of my school functions or plays, or any of my baseball games, which was pretty disheartening. My parents did their best to not make me feel so bad about it, and it typically worked. So, as I got older, with a good support system including my parents and family, who all loved and accepted me, thankfully, as well as my friends, I excelled in just about everything I did. I did great in school, and I already had ideas of what I wanted to do after I finished high school. And no, my intentions were not to work under my father in his accounting firm. I wanted to major in graphic design and business management, hoping to run my own business. That, of course, was inspired by my parents, as I wanted to be my own boss. I took all the extra classes that would help me get there, and I loved it. So, fast forward here, I was in my senior year of high school and, of course, was still living at home, and my brother Danny, now 32, had a place of his own. I was on our holiday break and was helping my parents prepare for Thanksgiving dinner. I helped my mom bake the pies the night prior and even helped my dad stock up on firewood so we could have the fireplace prepared. Our Thanksgiving was typically pretty small. It was usually just the four of us. Sometimes Danny would bring a girl with him that he was seeing at the time, and some of our neighbors would stop by, and my mom would exchange sweets with them. I loved our neighbor's pumpkin roll. The next Friday, the three of us would go over to my aunt's to have a bigger dinner with them, and my grandparents when they were around. So this year was no different. It started with the three of us, and Danny showed up later, but this time, he was later than usual. My mom had become a bit upset with him, as he hadn't even bothered to call and tell her, and these holidays were always very important to her. I mean, he's known her longer than me, so he should understand that, but he still didn't seem to care. When he finally arrived, my mom gave him one of her stern talkings, but then we all carried on. I tried talking to him on a few occasions and asked how he was doing, and he always just gave me these short answers and never offered the same. So, I never talked about myself to him. I had also noticed that he seemed to be on edge that evening. He would give short answers to my parents, and just seemed to be close to going off on someone the entire time. We finally got to dinner, and the dining room was set up to where you could see the TV in the living room from the table. My parents often left it on, especially on Thanksgiving, as my dad liked to watch the game. Surprisingly, Danny and I had that in common. Neither one of us liked football. But I was thankful that it was on because Otherwise, it would have been too quiet that day. They both still paid attention to the conversation, though, and thankfully my dad wasn't the type to shout at the TV from the table. The conversation started fine. My mom asked how Danny was doing and what he was up to. He learned that he'd had quite a thing for antique cars recently, and he was talking about opening his own car shop that specialized in antique cars. And my parents were supportive of that too. At the time, he was just working at a different shop and was going to some kind of school to learn about it, like a community college, I think it was. My mom asked how it was going, and I just remember him constantly complaining about it. He said that he hated the owners that he worked under, and the guys that he worked with were all jerks. He said that he didn't like his professor as he felt like he was targeting him, and how some of the assignments seemed irrelevant. Yet, my mom was always the optimistic type, and she tried her best to find some positive things about it. My dad even said that he was proud of him for still sticking with it, and that after he finished school, if he was still serious about it, he would go in on a loan to get him the property that he needed. When I heard this, I thought it was really cool, as it also seemed to loosen him up a bit too. I then joked, saying that I could help him set up his website and create a banner for him due to my work in exchange for a family discount on car repairs, because I did have an old used car at the time. He snapped at me, saying that he didn't need my help. My mom immediately told him to be nice because I was just trying to be helpful, but the damage was already done. I was upset, but I did my best to stay upbeat for the sake of my parents. However, it only seemed to get worse when my parents asked about my plans after school. I was keeping it a surprise for Christmas, but I thought maybe to lighten the mood I would go ahead and share it early. I told them how I had found a college that I wanted to go to, as it had a great graphic and web design program, and I had already completed the pre-enrollment process. There was a test that you had to take for acceptance, and I'd passed it all. I just had to complete the last part of the enrollment, and I was set. And they also had apartments that you could include in your tuition that were in the area. They weren't quite dorms, as they were bigger, and based on the pictures, they were actual apartments. So I was pretty excited to have my own place. So I told them about it. The light in my parents' eyes was enough to fill me with happiness again. My mom gave her little high-pitched voice and said how happy she was, and my dad said that he was proud of me and again offered to help me with my tuition. I was incredibly thankful for them and felt loved, but the happy feeling wouldn't last. Danny scoffed at me and said, "Okay, it's just a pre-assessment. You still have to be approved to get in." To which I corrected him, saying that I was approved. I was just under 18, so I didn't have an acceptance letter yet. They even explained that to me. He then laughed and said that that's not how the real world worked, and called me naive. I know it probably wasn't the right thing to do, but I was getting pretty upset. Everyone talked about him and congratulated him, but when it came to me, I was never good enough for him, and I never understood why. I told him, "Do you want me to get the letter to prove it?" And he responded by saying that he didn't need some kid trying to prove him wrong. My parents were trying to get us to stop, but I was already pretty annoyed, and I felt the need to stand up for myself and my parents. "What is your problem with me, Danny?" I said angrily as I sat in my seat. "My problem? You are the problem. I don't even know why you're here. You're not even part of this family. They just brought you in out of pity because your drugged-up mother left you to die." I remember the words like it had just happened, because it still hurts. I knew I was adopted. My parents never tried to hide it from me, but they never made me feel like I was second best or unloved. I knew they loved me. But now I finally knew for certain. It was finally clear what I had always feared. Danny never loved me, let alone even liked me. And I tried hard for his approval. My dad yelled at him for what he said to me, but I just told them that I was okay and that I would like to be excused. I got up and started towards my room, even as my mom pleaded for me to stay. As I put my plate in the sink and started walking away, Danny continued to mock me, saying more hurtful things, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I know this last part was my fault, but I'd been pushed to my limit. You know, Danny, maybe they adopted me because they wanted a second chance at a successful son. That was the first time that I had ever heard my mom say my name in a negative tone. I knew I was in trouble, but I really didn't care. But as I walked down the hall, I heard the sound of a chair scrape across the floor and heavy footsteps coming towards me. Then I heard my parents shouting for Danny. I barely turned around when I was met with his fist to my face. I collapsed to the floor and he proceeded to punch me a few more times in the face, and that was probably the worst pain that I'd ever experienced. I remember crying, or maybe trying to, and I heard my parents yelling at him before I finally blacked out. I woke up shortly after as my mom was trying to clean my face up. I was a mess. They took me to the hospital because I definitely needed stitches in my scalp, and unfortunately, because I was still a minor, they had to file a report. My brother was arrested, but none of us pressed charges, even when I was asked. I chose not to. My father really considered it too, but I think deep down he didn't want to either. I had a long talk with my parents who told me that I shouldn't have said what I said, and I agreed, and apologized to them because I knew it wasn't true. They weren't disappointed at him, but for some reason, he seemed to think that. And I knew that they loved me and were proud of me too, but I just couldn't take his hateful comments anymore. This was 2 years ago, and I've only seen my brother briefly twice since. Once when my mom had knee surgery, and once when he stopped by their place to pick up some of his mail while I was visiting. I still go home to visit them for holiday breaks, but he never comes. They go out and have dinner with him instead. I even apologized to him for what I said, and all he said in return was, "Okay." So, not even an apology from him. I don't even know if he is sorry. Anyways, this was my crazy family story. Even though it wasn't too scary, it was scary enough for me knowing what my brother did to me, as a minor while he was a full-fledged adult. I still hope that one day we may have a normal brotherly relationship, but until then, I guess I'll just pretend that I was an only child. I have a bit of an unconventional scary story that happened on a night shift that I worked a long time ago. I worked night shifts in the emergency room, which is a job that absolutely gives you a different perspective on life. And sometimes you have to deal with the darker side of human nature, and I've seen my share of strange, tragic, and unexplainable events. But there was one night that has stuck with me that was scary in its own way that I cannot shake off. The night started out a bit rough. It was a crazy, stormy night, complete with non-stop thunder and hail actually smacking everything. Despite this, the ER was actually pretty quiet, which is certainly a rare occurrence on a normal night, much less one where conditions aren't favorable. But as anyone that works in a hospital will tell you, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth, and you find appreciation for these rare nights. Around 3 a.m., we received a call that an ambulance was bringing in a woman that they'd found on the side of the road, and that she was unconscious and in pretty bad shape when they found her. When they wheeled her in, the sense of urgency hit us all, and I could see that she'd been through something intense. She was drenched, her clothes were torn, and she had multiple visible injuries. Even though she was unconscious, the look on her face was unsettling. She looked like she was in a mix of fear and agony, even though she was out completely cold. We all worked our asses off to stabilize her, to keep her alive and keep her going. As we worked to keep her stable, an officer arrived to give us some extra information. She'd been found by a passing truck driver, no identification, no vehicles nearby. This offered up a few possibilities, namely that she'd been hit and the other person took off. While tending to her, I noticed a few peculiarities about her injuries. They were severe, but they didn't align with the person versus vehicle accident. I've seen a number of those, and the telltale signs of them are typically evident. But this woman had different injuries. I also noted that she had bruises on her wrists and ankles. Bruises that looked more like they came from restraints, not an accident. As we continued to work her over, I noted a number of other injuries that looked like they would have come from a struggle more than a hit and run. Of course, we passed information on our Jane Doe along to the police as we could, but nothing was conclusive. After a while of working and getting her stabilized, she actually started to regain consciousness. Her eyes were wide, and she started freaking out and screaming. Not just a normal, where am I kind of scream. It was a loud and blood-curdling scream that made my blood run cold. She started shouting, asking what was going on, what was happening, and then said something that actually scared the hell out of me. And I'm sure everyone else in the room. "Let me go. They're still out there." Her panic was a bit infectious. The room jumped into overdrive to calm her down, trying to get her to stop thrashing and screaming, but it wasn't working. We tried to talk to her, but she was beyond consolation. We ended up having to administer sedatives to make sure that she didn't hurt herself further, or end up hurting one of us that was trying to calm her down. She slipped back into unconsciousness, and the room let out one hell of a collective sigh. The officer obviously had questions about what she said, and he stuck around with us, waiting for her to wake up again to get more information. I really couldn't shake off this feeling of dread that came with her comments about them still being out there. Who was it she was referring to? The only answer I could think of was that she was being held captive, and that she was running from them. A few hours passed, and the shift was coming to an end. By the time I was off, the sun was starting to come out, and the storm had thankfully passed. The woman didn't wake up for the rest of my shift, so I didn't get any immediate answers for my questions. I was told by a coworker that she did wake up later that day, but that her memory was terribly fragmented. She could remember running, she remembered hiding, but she didn't know what she was running from. The next thing she remembered was lying on the ground in the rain, thinking that she was about to die, but not knowing why or what had knocked her down. The police speculated that it was a possibility that she'd escaped from a kidnapping, but without more evidence, they couldn't really proceed on that front. She was moved out of emergency and into the step-down care. To the best of my knowledge, nothing ever came of that night, as far as if she was kidnapped or hit by a car during the storm. They never figured out how she ended up on the road, nor where she may have been being held. She wasn't a missing person. After she was identified and interviewed a bit, there was no indication of what had happened, other than that she'd gone to the movies that night by herself, went to a bar for one drink and left, and that's where her memories of that night stop. We never figured out what happened to her, and she never remembered. That's probably the most haunting night I've ever had working there, though I have a number of cases that some could deem as scary. This one, though, I think the mystery of it all really made it that much more terrifying. This happened back whenever I used to work the night shift at a bar and grill type restaurant, which would put it back between 2002 and 2004. I can't remember the exact day and month that it took place, but it was definitely somewhere in there. I'd been working there for a while by this time that this happened, and was definitely situated and understood the job. I'd been there long enough to know the regulars, the people that showed up every day or twice a week or so, and I'd memorized quite a few of the orders as well. To be honest, I hated the job, and I hated having to work until midnight, but it paid the bills, which was what I needed at the time. And thankfully, the rush of people usually came through at the beginning of my shift, and then it was just surviving until I got to go home. I remember that on that night, we were actually quite a bit busier than we normally were. I was running around, taking orders, moving plates, taking people to tables, all the things I was asked to do because we were short-staffed. I had taken the order of a couple of tables and was running over to the station to put them in, when I heard someone let out a scream, which obviously caught my attention. As I looked up, I heard a deafening crash and watched as a car plowed through the front of our restaurant. Glass flew all over the place, and all I could see were guests throwing themselves out of the way as the chaos unfolded. I stood there just watching this play out, as quick as it was. I never expected to be the kind of person that just stood there and watched as something like this happened in front of me, but the whole saying about train wrecks and not being able to look away was apparently true for me. When the dust finally settled, I could see the car. It was a battered old sedan, and it had stopped about halfway in the restaurant. By some miracle, none of the customers were injured. They were all shaken and scared, but none of them looked to be too badly hurt. Our cook, Hank, a bit of a burly man, was the first to jump into action. He started shouting to call 911 and ran over to the car. I was actually the one that grabbed the diner's landline and called it in. The whole time I was trembling and trying to piece together how something like this could have happened. That was actually about the time that I noticed Jenna, one of our waitresses, was actually pinned against one of the booths by the car. I wanted to panic, but I tried to remain calm as I explained to the dispatcher what had happened, and then told Hank that Jenna needed help. Thankfully, she was conscious. She was pretty clearly messed up and in pain, but it was just her leg that was trapped. And that's about the time when the driver of the car stepped out. He was an older guy, and I could smell the alcohol on him from where I was standing. He shoved the door open and stumbled out, clearly disoriented, and started shouting with a slur. He yelled out at us, "Sorry about that. I could pay for the door. I just need to get a burger to sober up, 'cause I have to work in the morning." I just stared at this guy with absolute shock. He really did not seem to notice what he had done. He just kept shouting that he wanted a double cheeseburger with mayonnaise, and started getting frustrated when no one was taking his order. Hank and a few of the customers were able to push the car back enough to free Jenna. She was pretty clearly terrified of what had happened, and I think that she realized how close to death she'd actually come that night. She said that her leg really hurt, but for the most part, she looked like she was going to be okay. The whole time they were helping her, the old man that was driving the car just stood there and watched them like they were inconveniencing him, until he decided to just sit at the bar and watch it all play out. Thankfully, the paramedics and the police were quick, and they showed up within a few minutes. Jenna was rushed to the hospital, the medics were treating the patrons that had some minor injuries, and the police were very quick to arrest the old man that was driving, though he was pretty mad about that fact. He kept screaming that he wasn't even drunk, that he hadn't even been drinking, and that he just wanted a cheeseburger. Obviously, the night was over for the restaurant, and the rest of the night was a blur of talking to the cops and explaining what happened, calling the owner, and the slow process of helping to board up the front. They told me that I could go, but part of me felt like I should help clean up after all was said and done. I think I was still in a bit of shock. After a little bit, though, I crashed pretty hard. I think the adrenaline started ebbing away and I was drained. Working in food, for the most part, I feel like we meet and greet people and fully never expect them to have an impact on our lives. But that old man impacted so many people's lives in the most destructive way possible. Jenna ended up lucky to only have a broken leg, but she was alive. We all were, which honestly was a shock to me. That man could have killed multiple people. All it would have taken was a bit more pressure on the gas, being a couple of spots to the left where there were more people seated. It was a bit haunting to think about, and when the store finally reopened, I was still a bit nervous about pretty much everything. Jenna actually came back too, albeit in a much less work-heavy capacity since she was still in a cast and had crutches. Hank was given an honorary award by the owner for jumping into action, and both of those things were nice, but I think we were all still pretty freaked out about everything that had happened. Every time around this time of year, there is an event that comes back to the front of my mind. There are a few people from the family that are reminded of it by others, while some of us crack jokes about it now. I'm sure it definitely wasn't funny at the time, but now, it's a way for some of us to get past it. Humor can be healing, right? As a child, I remembered our family always having a pretty extensive Thanksgiving. My grandparents had a nice-sized house, and they would always host it. My parents, my two siblings, and I would always be there, as well as plenty of aunts and uncles and cousins. I had a lot of cousins close to my age, so I always had plenty of kids around to play with too. I was probably 10 at the time of this event. In fact, I had just turned 10 the month prior, in October. There was also one uncle specifically that I loved being around, Uncle Rob. He was very friendly and was the type to listen to you no matter your age, and was always engaged in the conversation, saying he was proud of you, excited for you, things like that. I knew the grandparents of the house we were at were my mom's parents because she always called them Mom and Pops. But I remember asking if Uncle Rob was Mom's brother or Dad's brother. At the time, I was curious because they both called him by his name, but still hugged him and treated him as a brother. But at the time, my older brother and younger sister both called me Bubba, so being a kid, I was confused why they didn't call him that. Their answer was kind of ambiguous at first. They said he wasn't really the brother to either of them, but that he was like a brother, and explained in a way how he was kind of adopted into the family. They also asked me not to mention it to anyone as it could hurt someone's feelings. I agreed, and never really thought anything more of it. I never thought of him any differently. And he also had a son, my cousin Dylan. And he was one of my favorite cousins. He's about 2 or 3 years older than I was, and was still interested in the same things, such as the Pokemon card game. So I looked at him as someone cool and often hung out with him when we worked together. So on this Thanksgiving, we all started arriving. We were one of the first ones there, and my mom helped with a lot of the cooking. Shortly after everyone else got there, all of us kids were playing in the back living room, while most of the adults were sprinkled around the kitchen and living rooms. As usual, it was a great time. All of us kids talked, made up games, and played with some of the toys and setups our grandparents kept around for us, and we would randomly hear the adults talking and laughing too. Amidst the chatter of the house, it seemed to get quieter on the adult side of things. I didn't hear a lot of people shouting or laughing, and I got curious. I told my cousins that I would be back and walked towards the kitchen to get a drink, which was an easy enough ruse to give myself a reason to check on what was going on. While standing in the kitchen, I could hear the music that my grandma had turned on earlier, something we couldn't hear because of how loud the house had gotten. But even more curious was the conversation that I was hearing, and a raspy, slurred voice that I couldn't place. The conversation definitely was not a happy one, and I once again wanted to see what was going on. I approached the doorway to the living room where my Uncle Rob was blocking it. I managed to duck under him a bit, and I saw a woman standing by the front door. She had on a very short dress and sneakers, with a thick, fluffy coat hanging off her shoulders. But there was a very weird feeling in the air. It was like anger and fear. It was a very similar feeling to when I did something bad and my parents yelled at me, middle name and all. But it wasn't towards me. I could tell that it was for this strange woman. Now, this may not be exactly the conversation since it has been several years since this event, but between what I remember and what my parents have told me, this is what I heard. My grandpa was the first person that I heard talking to the woman at the door, and he sounded very angry. It was not a tone that I was used to hearing from him. He told her that she wasn't supposed to be there, which seemed to make the woman angry. Why not? Why can't I see my family? I want to see my son. My grandpa responded angrily, but keeping his voice low. You've been given chances time and time again, Margaret. We can't keep doing this. It's not fair to us, and it's not fair to Dylan. I just want to have Thanksgiving with my family. Why is he allowed to be here but not me? I'm your daughter, Arthur, she yelled as she pointed at my Uncle Rob. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't know who this woman was, but she was claiming to be my grandpa's daughter. I knew all of my mom's siblings. Even if we weren't close, I could still name them all off. And she was not on that list. Why did she seem so angry at my Uncle Rob? My grandpa started yelling at her that she was not allowed there anymore until she was clean, and told her that she needed to leave before he called the cops. My mom then approached the woman, but I could see the sadness in her eyes as she shuffled her out the front door. After she left, and my mom came back in, the atmosphere still felt tense, until my grandma said something to lighten the mood. Thankfully, it didn't take long before everyone loosened up, and we were all back to having fun again. When my mom realized I was there, she pulled me to the side and made me promise to not mention the situation that I witnessed to Uncle Rob, and especially not to Dylan, to which I agreed. Once the celebration was back into full swing, we started smelling something funny. At this point in the night, I had gone to the front living room and was watching TV with my grandmother, and she hollered for someone to check the stove because she could smell something burning. I started to smell it too, but I remember it being something specific that I couldn't quite pinpoint. One of my uncles came into the living room and confirmed the stove was not on, but then his face twisted and confirmed what we were smelling. It was wood. Almost like what we would smell when we had a bonfire, but it also had a chemical smell to it, what I now recognize as the smell of treated wood burning. Many of the adults started looking concerned, and were looking around the house frantically, doing a head count on all the kids. Then my dad came back in from the front door, and was telling us all to get out. As the adults grabbed all of us kids, we all ran out, and That's when I saw the smoke. The sun was setting, but I could still see the dark smoke billowing into the sky. The fire trucks showed up quickly and put out the fire before significant damage was done. The fire had started by the garage and spread to the spare bedroom behind it that was just being used as storage. The rest of that night was a blur as I felt like I slept in spurts. We all were there pretty late. My parents were talking to a lot of cops and walking around the house. After some time, my dad took us kids home and my mom stayed there. Over the next few days, things calmed down and life seemed to continue as normal, other than a few extra trips to my grandparents because my dad helped fix up their house. I kept my promise, and even though I was very curious about that incident, I never asked or mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't until years later that I was finally let in on the details of that day and how we got there. The mystery lady, Margaret, is actually my aunt, my mom's youngest sister, and my Uncle Rob was her ex-husband, making Dylan her son. My Aunt Margaret had an issue with drugs, and she met my Uncle Rob when she was trying to get clean. He was apparently a huge asset in keeping her sober, and they ended up getting married and having Dylan. However, shortly after Dylan was born, she seemed to relapse, and she was putting the three of them in dangerous situations. So, with my grandparents' support, Uncle Rob told her that she needed to get clean again or that they would get a divorce and that he would take Dylan. She responded to this by trying to stab my Uncle Rob while Dylan slept in his room nearby. Obviously, she was unsuccessful and went away for some time, but apparently, that time did not sober her up. Uncle Rob didn't have much in the way of his own biological family, so he was accepted into our family with open arms. And that's why my mom always just explained that he was adopted by us. So when my Aunt Margaret showed up at that Thanksgiving, obviously under the influence of something, she was told to leave. And, once again, she took revenge by setting the house on fire. They easily found evidence supporting this, and she went away for several more years. As far as I know, from those in my family that I do keep in contact with, no one has heard from her in years. My mom says that she still feels bad for her, but she's also aware and understands that she keeps putting herself in these situations. It was really scary at the time, thinking that my aunt, this woman that I'd never met, was willing to set her parents' house on fire, while it was filled with her family, and even her son, just out of anger. And while I really don't care to meet her at this point in my life, I do hope that she's at least okay and possibly gotten better. And, hopefully, has never tried to do something so violent to another person again. I wouldn't normally share this story on the internet, but I'm going to go ahead and send it to you with a request to remain anonymous just in case. Honestly, after what happened, I kind of feel like it's necessary, because it was one of those situations that others should know about. I live in a fairly large apartment complex, in a part of town that is questionable. The community/complex is fine overall, but the location is sketchy. We've had a string of car and apartment break-ins over the past year or two. Because of this increase in crime, the community has installed a gate at the front that is closed after 10 p.m., and they hired a couple of guards that are stationed in the lot overnight. For the most part, it's actually been kind of nice to have the security guards on the property, as it does make me feel a lot safer. At least, until they hired a guy named Jeb. I'm not one to judge people based on things like names, but when we got the email from the office saying that they had hired a man named Jeb, I didn't have high hopes, that's all. My initial impression didn't get any better when I finally met him. He was a big guy. Not fat, just really bulky. When I first met him, I tried my best to be polite and to say hi to him. I work in customer service, so I have that customer service smile. And when I said hi to him, he sort of just grunted. After that, I made it a point to just not talk to him, as that was, 1, rude, and 2, kind of creepy. Who grunts when someone says hi? Anyways, I avoided him and didn't acknowledge him at all, so he pretty much just left my mind altogether. My friend Jessica was the one that initially noticed that something was off about him. Jessica doesn't live in the complex, but she'd been staying with me for a couple of weeks because she was having issues in her personal life. I've known her since we were in preschool, so I had no issue offering my couch to her when she asked. She was in the laundry room of the building, doing her laundry as one does, and at one point, Jeb walked into the laundry room. The laundry room in our building has the washer and dryers, but also has all of the tenants' storage units. It's a small and sort of cramped room, but it has enough space for one to sit if they need to. And that's about it. She was sitting there, waiting for the 10 or so minutes to pass by, and just scrolling on her phone when Jeb walked in. He looks at her, and then walks past her to the other side of the hallway-like area, and leans against the wall. He then pulls out his phone and just starts scrolling, but is very clearly not actually reading anything. After the buzzer goes off on the washer, Jessica gets up to change them over to the dryer, and Jeb pushes off the wall and slowly walks towards her. She notices him, but doesn't want to make an issue. She's not on the lease here and technically shouldn't be using the facilities until he gets too close. From what she told me, he was uncomfortably close to her, and just looking over her shoulder as she was moving her clothes. At one point, she pulls out a pair of underwear and moves it, and she hears him say, "Nice," under his breath. She shivered, but just finished moving it all, put the change in for the dryer, and turned around, only to be met with him standing less than arm's length away from her. As soon as she turned around, he smirked and said, "Hey, can I get your phone number?" She was shocked at how brazen he was, and she told him that she wasn't interested. She said that he chuckled at this response and then said, "You live in Unit 203, right?" Which is my unit where she was staying. She asked him why he was bothering her, and he just said, "I'm just doing my normal rounds, making sure you're not up to something suspicious." At this point, she said that she'd had enough, so she told him that he was being creepy with his comments, and that it was not appropriate to ask her for her phone number, and then ask which unit she lived in. She told him that if he kept bothering her and being inappropriate, she was going to report him to the office. He just laughed and shook his head, and told her to have a good night, and then left. She made sure that he walked out of the building and then immediately ran over to my unit to tell me about what had happened. I told her that I wanted her to report him anyways, and that they needed to know that he was a creep. She agreed, but was hesitant at first, saying that he didn't really do anything. I mentioned that he may not have done anything this time or to her, but there was a real possibility that could change next time, with the next person. That seemed to make her change her mind, and she said that she would go ahead and report him. The next morning, I went down to the office with her and informed them of the situation. They were a bit confused since Jessica doesn't live here, but I told them that she was staying with me for a couple of days and that she was helping me with my laundry, and that's why she was there. They seemed to be okay with that and asked for more details. She told them everything, and the person that took our complaint seemed to take it seriously. They said that they would talk with him and that they would take action, and apologized that it happened. We thought that that would be the end of it, that he would either get fired or that he would get the hints. But he didn't, and he didn't. About 2 days later, we were in my living room and heard a knock on the door. I get up to answer it, looking through the peephole and see Jeb just standing there. I stop and think about whether or not I should answer the door, but he knocks again and says, "This is security. I need you to open the door." I sighed and did what he mentioned, keeping it chained just in case. As I opened the door, he actually ran into it. Like, physically bumped into the door. I'm guessing because he didn't expect me to have it chained and he was planning on just walking into the apartment. Once he regained his composure, I asked him if I could help him, and he immediately told me that I needed to open the door all the way. I told him that I didn't feel comfortable doing so, and he immediately got angry. He said, "You need to open the door. I am with security, and I need to check your apartment." I stared at him blankly for a moment, and asked him why he would need to check my apartment. He responded with, "I have reports there are people living in this unit that aren't supposed to be here, and aren't on the lease, and I want to check just to make sure." I once again just told him no, that he couldn't just enter my apartment at any time that he wanted, and that if they were going to send someone, they needed to call me with 24 hours notice, according to my lease. He immediately raised his tone, saying, "You're going to open this door right now, or you're going to be kicked out. I am here to check the apartment. It's an emergency." I kept up my questioning, asking what the emergency was, whose life or property was at risk, according to him. He tried to say something like, "You may have a murderer in there hiding for all I know, so this is an emergency." I just shook my head and laughed at him, telling him that if he really thought that, then the office either needed to call me to talk to me, or he needed to contact the police and have them check out my apartment. I then moved to shut my door, and he reached his arm in and around the door trying to grab at the chain lock. I immediately shoved the door as hard as I could, and screamed, saying that he was trying to break into my apartment, screaming for help, trying to get the attention of the neighbors. Thankfully, it worked, and I could hear several of the doors opening in the hallway, and people asking what was going on. I think he realized the implications, and he immediately pulled his arm back and turned to walk away. As he was walking away, I heard him yell, "Get back in your apartments. There's nothing to see here." Like he wasn't just some security guard and had some kind of actual authority. Obviously, our neighbors came to my door and asked if we were okay and what was happening. We explained the whole thing to them, and they agreed that everything he was doing was a problem, and that he definitely had something planned with what he was doing. I actually called the police to make a report, and when the cops came out, all of the neighbors corroborated what I was saying. They said that they would do a drive around to see if they could find him, and that they would be back with a police report for me to give to the office. Thankfully, this was the end of all this. We took the report to the office, and they told us that they had gotten calls from several neighbors in our building about the whole situation, and that they had let him go that morning, and that he was basically barred from the property. They also said they would assist in any way they could if the police wanted to pursue the investigation. As it is, I haven't seen him since this all happened, and I think he realized that he was treading shallow water, and that if he continued, he was going to end up in jail. In my opinion, he should have been arrested for what he did anyways, but I don't believe that he was. In the end, it was a terrifying situation, one that caused me to really not feel safe in my own home. The experience left me rattled, and I'm nervous anytime someone from the property has to come to my door, but thankfully nothing has happened since all of this played out. When I was in uni, I needed to pay my bills, and I got a job at the local Makas to support myself, because study doesn't pay enough. I've always been a night owl, and I figured the night shifts would be perfect for me. It's either super busy or really quiet. And the other staff members teased me when it was going to be my first night and told me that it was going to be fun. All the online order apps kept ordering, Uber Eats, Menulog, DoorDash, and all the others. So I mainly spent time organizing the orders, checking to see if they were legit, and handing food over. Then, I was asked to work at the drive-thru. Now, late-night Makas runs are a big thing here. I've done them plenty of times with my mates too, and yeah, we were dickheads to people. The first lot of cars were okay. Just some kids wanting some late-night munchies. The next car pulled up to order, and they used their horn right away. I could tell that they were going to be rude. I asked them for their order, and they called me a variety of names, but I went ahead and took their orders. Better to get them out so they don't bother anybody. I didn't see this part, but I heard them shouting at my coworkers, calling her a C-word and a B-word. It's one thing to say it to me, but another to say it to someone else. They then threw their hot coffee and food bag at her. We closed the window, and we called the police. They weren't done yet, though. They then threw something, and it actually broke one of the windows. Then they sped off before the police got there. Makas has cameras, so we passed along that information and continued with our night. I don't understand why people pull this crap, but they came back. They tried to get in, and they yelled at us through the glass window, banged on the doors, and said that they just wanted to speak with us. We did not let them in. They actually broke another of the windows, and then spray painted the outside. People tend to act feral at Makas, and there have been fights and drug deals in our car park. It's absolutely wild. Truly, the best and the brightest come out, and I hope people can tell I'm being sarcastic when I say that. Anyways, the cops came, they got arrested, and the next day I told people about the shift. The next few couple of nights were pretty uneventful, same old, but the next weekend, they were back. This time they came in during open hours, acting like nothing had ever happened. We served them, and, of course, there was a mistake with their order. So, the bogans threw it on the floor, screamed at some 16-year-old at the cash register, and threatened to come back and stab us. Some of the other bogans told them to screw off, and then a fight erupted. I have no idea why people willingly come to Makas at this point. Chairs were thrown, there was blood on the floor, and none of the people minding their own damn business ended up getting hurt. But it doesn't end there. Oh no. This stupid freaking saga continues with one of the idiots coming back after his brother got arrested because we dobbed him in. I think it was about 4, maybe 5 days later. Not quite a week. It was after we were able to finally reopen. This smooth-brained moron thought it was somehow our fault that his brother got in trouble for doing what he did. He came in at nighttime when the late-night staff and the morning crew were switching over. Unfortunately, he wasn't as violent as his brother and nothing got smashed up. It was just more of a nuisance. He was herded out, yelling and telling us that he was going to come back, but he didn't do anything. The family does come back every now and then. Most of the time they're okay. I don't understand how people can behave like this, and still expect to be treated well. My managers are all so nonchalant about it. So long as they pay and keep coming back, it's fine, I guess. Part of the fun of working in a suburb next to a massive crap hole. If you've seen the series Housos on TV, that's pretty much where I worked back in the day. People there can be so freaking rough. So, that's my story. I don't work at Macas anymore, but it was mostly a good job. I even got free Macas pretty regularly, and some of the bosses were alright too. If you ever need more Maka stories, I got you, Birdman. So, yeah, that's my train wreck of a story. I never really believed in the whole being watched sensation until it happened to me. Until I had to live through an event that made me feel the terror of it all. I'm a college student. I work nights at a convenience store near my campus. It's nothing glorious. It's a very thankless job in an old and beaten down little store that sells as much alcohol and candy as we do gas. Of course, the store has to add to the creepy ambience, right? The lights flicker, door out back makes this grating creak noise that makes the hair on my arms stand every single time it opens. Other than that, the store is deafeningly silent, minus the soda fountain sometimes making strange noises. It's a job that pays, and that's about the end of it. You'd think that the scariest thing that you'd have to deal with at these kinds of jobs would be the occasional drunk or irate customer. Doubly so if the customer is both drunk and you won't sell him alcohol, so he becomes irate. It's the den of the night, so really you wouldn't think that anything creepy would actually occur. Plus, we're near the school and close to a cop shop. People know not to do anything stupid since we can get a cruiser there in about 3.5 minutes. I would know as I timed it. I once had to call on a drunk guy trying to drive out of my lot. By the time I'm at the middle of my shift, the world is asleep, so really I just get to sit there and wait for the morning to come so that I can go home. There was one night where, as I said earlier, things shifted from normal to creepy. I was sitting there waiting for my shift to end when an older guy walked into the store. I looked up to greet him, customer service and whatnot, and when I looked out the window past him, I saw this random guy standing outside. He was across the street just behind the streetlight, and with how the light was glowing down, I couldn't see his face under his hoodie. There was something about how he was just standing there that was making me feel genuinely unsettled. He wasn't just there for the hell of it. He wasn't waiting for the bus. It was like he was deliberately standing there and watching the store. Watching me. He didn't have a dog. He didn't have a phone out or anything. It was just him in the night. Now, I'm a pretty big dude. I'm 6'2", a little over 230, and not easily spooked. But the way this guy was just staring in my direction without moving was seriously freaky. After I rang up the old guy, I sat back down on my stool and just watched him as he watched me. Part of me was thinking that he was going to do something, like run at the store, pull out a gun, just something that would justify my terror of him, but he didn't. After about an hour and a half of him just standing there and staring, he took a step forward and then turned left and walked away, down the sidewalk. No lie, it was a relief to watch him walk away. But, of course, that wasn't the end. The next night that I worked, around 2 in the morning, I looked up and sure enough, he was standing there again. At first I was mentally certain that it was just another guy standing there. That there was no way in hell this dude was going to spend a couple more hours in the middle of the night just watching the store for fun. But after I stared at him for a couple of minutes, I could tell that he was wearing the same shorts and same hoodie. And I knew it was him for certain. I tried to shake it off, tried to laugh at myself, and thought, wow, Jason, you're getting paranoid. But this eerie feeling was settling in my gut, and it would not go away. Something was off, way off. So I did what I think anyone would do if they were in my position, working at 3 in the morning behind the counter of a giant robbery target. I called the police. I explained that there was a man that had been loitering around the store, and that I would appreciate an officer to just maybe check him out. Or maybe just come to the store and make sure nothing happened. It was a bit of an exaggeration. He wasn't technically loitering around the store, but it wasn't wholly untrue. And they said that they would send a unit to the store to check in. I thanked her and hung up. That's when things went from freaky to, holy crap, what is happening? As soon as I hung up from the dispatcher, I looked up and watched as this man reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone and placed it to his ear. Then, right on cue, the phone to the store started ringing. I was still in this weird mentality of denial. I was thinking that there was absolutely no way that it was this guy, that the timing was just a big coincidence. I picked it up and answered, saying the name of the store. The voice on the other end immediately cut in and said, "I hope you have a good night, Jason." The voice was low and quiet, and the call ended as they finished their statement, which to me made it feel like a threat. When the call ended, the man on the other side of the street put his phone away and immediately started walking away from his post under the streetlight. I stood there watching him walk, holding the phone receiver in my hand, not sure what this was at this point. I didn't answer the phone saying my name, so him referring to me by name was unsettling. It was entirely possible that he'd been in the store at some point and interacted with me, and I just never noticed it was him, but it was still freaky. After about 10 minutes, the officers finally pulled up, which was a disappointing response time, but I guess it was just a loitering call. I explained the whole thing to them, and then told them immediately after calling them that the man called me, and told them what he'd said. They seemed to want to take it seriously, but I think at the same time this guy hadn't done anything actually illegal, so they had to just say that they would drive around and see if they could find him. And that was it. I finished out my shift, thankful to not see the man out there for the rest of the night. This wasn't the last event, but it was the last one that happened at my work. What happened after this is the most recent thing to happen, but is also the most terrifying, albeit the least eventful. About 2 days after the night where I called the cops, I was at home getting ready for work and whatnot, and when I went out to leave, I noticed that there was a slip of paper under my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was a ticket, or a warning for parking there or something, which was confusing, but it was the most logical explanation. But when I pulled the page out and looked at it, I was horrified. On the page, right there in black and white, was a written note that said, "I'll be around, Jason. I'm not scared of the police." When I read this, the world felt like it was spinning. What the hell had I done to this person? Why were they latching on to me like this? I really didn't know what to do. Should I call the cops? Was this just an empty threat? Was this some kind of stalker that was waiting to escalate the situation? I did contact the police, and when they showed up, I explained the situation that had taken place at work, which thankfully did add a bit of credence to my story. And then I showed them the note that I had just found. And they thought it was freaky, and they agreed that this could be a weird stalker situation, but there wasn't much to go on beyond the person just being creepy. After a bit more talking about things, they basically gave me an open case number and told me that if I saw this person at all, or if they contacted me, to contact them immediately, and this would be an open investigation into potential stalking. Fortunately, this is where the story ends, for now. It's been 2 months, and I haven't heard from this person nor seen them since then. I don't know if that's a good thing, or if they're waiting for me to let my guard down, but it's definitely scaring the hell out of me. In these past 2 months, I've been feeling like I'm being watched, being followed, and I swear that I am jumping at literally every shadow. I've kind of started secluding myself, only spending time at work and home, not going out into public just in case. If anyone has any suggestions, I am open to them, so please do let me know what I should do. I am armed, so if this person tries anything at home, I can do something about it. But I can't open carry, so out in public the only thing I can hope to protect me is the fact that this is out in the open. In the end, I think I'm safe, since it has been so long. But of course, I am scared of the possibility of them coming back. It's a terrifying feeling, and I may just be being paranoid, but if that paranoia saves me, then so be it, I guess. About 10 years ago, I worked night shift as a nurse assistant at an assisted living facility. The building itself wasn't old. It was built just a couple of years before I had started working there. Even so, several unexplainable things happened there. Occasionally, I saw black shadows in my peripheral vision. In the middle of the night, the elevator would come downstairs and open with no one in it, and door alarms would go off with no one there. The experience that I'm about to share is the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. On night shift, there are 3 employees. One nurse assistant that stays on the memory care side at all times, one that stays on the assisted living side, that was me, and a nurse. The nurse and I were watching TV on the assisted living side around 1 a.m., and all of a sudden this old-fashioned 1910s style music started playing loudly in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. I thought that someone was blasting their TV or radio, and I was afraid that they were going to wake the other residents up. We were on the first floor next to the front door, and you can look over this area from the second floor balcony. It sounded like the music was coming from somewhere on the second floor, so we walked up the stairs. When I reached the area where I thought it was coming from, the music faded away until I couldn't hear it anymore. I thought the nurse was playing a trick on me, but he genuinely looked terrified. He also looked harder for the source of the music than I did, looking behind pillows and books for a speaker. I didn't look with him because it was clearly coming from a distance. We searched the entire building, but every time we would walk in any direction, the music would fade away. It was loudest where we were sitting when it began. When we'd given up looking for answers, we went back to watching TV, and I tried my best to ignore it. After a few hours, I realized that it had finally stopped. The nurse and I worked together for 2 years after that, but we never spoke of that night again. The experience was so odd, and it's the main reason that I'm able to keep an open mind when hearing some of the more bizarre glitch stories about things that I've never experienced myself. And thank you so much for sharing, if you choose to do so. Hello. I work for Gloria Jeans. It's a coffee place here in Australia that sounds a lot like Starbucks. That being said, I've never actually been to a Starbucks. Anyway, the chain is fairly popular around Australia. I've worked here for about 2 years, and I started when I went to university studying women's studies. I'm still working at Gloria Jeans because the cost of living in Australia is so damn expensive, so I need it as a side job. Basically, I really need this job to help me stay afloat. I was serving in the morning rush of people who were waiting with varying degrees of patience for their morning coffee, when I noticed a woman that I hadn't seen before. I asked her for her order, and, to be honest, I don't remember what it was, nor her name. It's hard to remember it at all. The morning rush was over, and she was still there. There was nothing that weird about her, and she didn't give us any trouble like our Karen or Darren characters would. I asked her if she was okay, and she asked me how I was doing. I said that I was okay, just the morning rush can be intense. She asked if she could ask me a few more questions, and since it was quiet and management likes when we have a good rapport with the customers, I agreed. She asked me if I had a partner, and I said no, not at the moment, and I swear that her face lit up. So far, nothing was super weird, but I apologized to her and told her that I wasn't looking. She really didn't look fazed. Every day after that, she showed up and she wanted to speak with me. It was getting annoying. She would wait there all day and follow me when I had my time off work. I told her that I was on break and needed some space to eat and to rest. And she would sit at the table across from me staring and eating her food. She hadn't done anything violent, just really weird. I asked her to be left alone, and she sulked and got up and left. But she was back again the next day. I talked to my manager about it, and he really did not take it seriously. I had to take my car into the repair shop to get fixed, so I had to catch the bus instead. I hate taking public transport, but it was either that or an Uber. I wanted to save some cash, so... Anyways, she was on the same bus and got off at my stop. I had to sneak through different apartment blocks to hide from her so that she wouldn't know where I lived. I told my manager all about what had happened that day, and finally, he asked her to leave the store. I tried ignoring her. One day I had to work late, and I was walking out to where I had parked my car, and when I got out there, she was sitting on my car and was waiting for me. I said, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" And she said that she had been waiting for me all day and that she'd missed me. I told her to leave me alone and drove home. This was where I made a big mistake. I didn't realize that she had put an AirTag on my car and found out my address. Over the next couple of months, I was sure that someone was looking through my windows. One of my plants was stolen. I'm not sure if it was her or not, but yeah. And I noticed strange little bottles on my front step. It was incredibly weird. I didn't see her at my house until I realized I forgot to take the bins out, so I did that, came back inside, and closed and locked the door. Then, I got back inside and saw her sitting in my living room. I let out a scream when I saw her, and a maniacal grin spread across her face. She told me that she'd been waiting so long for this. I ran to my phone and I called the cops while she was trying to take the phone from me, screaming at the top of her lungs that she loved me and that I was hers. I was backed up into the kitchen when she grabbed one of the knives and started to threaten me with it. I punched her to get her away from me. Then the crazy woman started slicing into her own arm. It was the most insane thing I have ever seen. My neighbors heard the screaming and the police and an ambulance came to take her away. She'd lost a lot of blood. And surprisingly, the cops were able to get her to drop the knife. I don't know what I would have done if they were forced to use lethal force in my home. She was arrested, and I think that she was sent to a mental health facility. I do hope that she is okay. I'm just happy to be done with it. I have a story about when I used to manage a local coffee shop that, for me, was the most terrifying and downright unsettling thing that I have ever gone through. I didn't work for Starbucks or Tim Hortons or anything. It was a tiny little local coffee shop called Corner Cup Cafe. And when I say it was a tiny coffee shop, I mean tiny. We had 3 tables in the whole shop, and barely enough room to set up the shop's shelving and the merchandise. I'd been working there since the shop had opened, mostly because my mom was really good friends with the owner, Shelley. Shelley was a lovely lady, God rest her soul, who knew how to run a cafe. She knew how to make people love her product, and she had charisma like you would not believe. I had actually helped set up the sitting area, as small as it was, and she was more than pleased with it, so she hired me on full time. I was also one of the only people willing to work the closing shift for the store, and there were a number of nights where I would be the only person that would be there by the end of the night. She would schedule a couple of people, but usually I would go ahead and send them home about an hour before close to cut the labor costs, because we would always be dead by the end of the night. That's all important to know, as what happened was after the other person had been sent home. So it was somewhere between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. It was a pretty normal midweek night. We weren't busy, obviously, and there hadn't been a customer for about an hour or so I was just there chilling and cleaning up the line behind the counter, getting ready to clean up the front of the store so that I could finish up the closing checklist. To top it all off, it was a really dark night. It was storming out, and while I wasn't looking forward to the drive home in it, I was enjoying the rain pattering on the building while the coffee shop piano music played over the speakers. It was actually kind of mesmerizing, and very calming. As I'm finishing up the sweeping, the doorbell chimes and in comes a man that, to be honest, was a bit odd from the jump. I don't mean that he was wearing like a clown suit or anything, just that he was a bit off. He walked up to the register, didn't say a word, just pointed to the coffee dispenser behind me that held the house roast. I asked him what size he wanted, and he just kind of stared at me with this solemn look and didn't say a word. It was a bit awkward, but looking at this man, he looked like he was incredibly sad. Like he had just been to a funeral and was still reeling in the pain of his loss. When this clicked in my head, I started to feel bad for him. So I just said, "Hey, how about this? Since we're about to close, I'll go ahead and give you a large on the house. You just have to promise to come back another time if you enjoy it, okay?" Trying to be friendly and inviting as I could. Trying to give him a bit of a reason to smile if possible. But he didn't. He just sort of nodded, and it actually made me feel worse. I poured the coffee and placed it on the counter in front of him, and told him that I hoped that he had a lovely night, and then also mentioned that he should try to stay dry out there. He just nodded again, grabbed his coffee, and walked away. But instead of leaving, he sat at one of the tables and was just facing the window and watching the storm. Him sitting in the lobby wasn't something that I wanted. I was about to finish out closing, but I also didn't feel right kicking him out into the storm if we were going to be open for about another 20 to 30 minutes. I just accepted it, and I went back to cleaning up behind the line. I then also did some prep for the next morning's crew. After I finish up literally every cleaning thing that I can do, I glance down at my watch and see that it's about 10 minutes after 9 p.m., meaning that we had been officially closed for about 10 minutes. I felt bad about telling him to leave, but I had to count down the register, which I couldn't do until he left, Store policy was to never count down the cash in the drawer until the lobby was empty and the door was locked. Theft prevention for the most part. I looked up and politely said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I do have to ask that you finish up your coffee and head out. We closed at 9 and I have to wrap up so that I can head home." He didn't look over at me at all. He didn't say anything, he just continued to sit there and stare out the window. I'd mentioned that I would give him a few more minutes to finish his coffee, but that I would have to ask him to leave pretty soon so that I could lock up. I went to the back and did what I needed to there, and I walked up to the front and then pretended to count out the tips in the tip jar. Twice. The whole time, he just stayed there and did not leave. At that point, I figured that I needed to go ahead and be a little less polite. I walked over to the table where he was sitting and stood in front of him, just off to the side a bit, and said, "I'm really sorry, sir, but I have to ask you to leave. I need to lock the door and get out of here, so I really need you to go ahead and go. We open at 7 a.m. if you want to come back, but I have to get the store locked up and leave." When I said this, he glanced up at me and just sort of nodded. Then he stood up and slowly made his way to the door. As he gets to the door, he looks back at me and actually gave me a slight smile before lifting his coffee at me, kind of like saying thanks without saying anything, and then he walked out into the night. I felt pretty bad, but it was what it was. I went ahead and locked the door as he exited, went back to the register and counted it down. By the time I left, it was almost 10 p.m. And I knew that Shelley was going to be a bit upset that I was so late finishing up, but I knew that she would understand with the customer being in there. Customer satisfaction was important for her, and I was sure that she would get it. If not, I would just take the talking to and move on. Odds are, she really wouldn't care that much. She would just tell me to be a bit more assertive. But when I got there the next day for my shift, the situation was not quite what I was expecting. She called me into her office, as I expected, and she asked me what happened last night with closing. I told her that there was a last-minute customer, mentioned the guy that I had given the coffee to, and how he sat in the lobby late, and then told her that he looked like he'd had a really rough day and that, as much as I wanted to tell him to leave, I just couldn't bring myself to. He really looked like he needed a few minutes to himself. She stared at me with a confused look the entire time, and then asked me when the customer came in. I told her that it was around 8:30, 8:35-ish. She then asked me if I was feeling okay, which was a really weird thing to ask. I told her I was fine and asked her why. She turned to her computer and asked me to watch something. I watched as she opened up the footage for the camera and turned it back to around when I mentioned. I watched as I turned to the door and waved, and then leaned over the counter and looked like I was asking what I could get for someone. But there was no one there. I watched as I turned to fill a paper cup with coffee, placed it on the counter, and just stared into the lobby for a few blank seconds. She fast-forwarded a bit, and I watched myself talk to nobody. Then watched as I walked over to an empty table, and once again started talking to no one. There was nobody in the lobby the entire time that he was supposed to be there. I was walking around and talking to no one like an absolute lunatic on camera. Worse yet, after I closed up and turned off the light, the coffee cup was still sitting on the counter, and it was there when she had opened that morning. I stood there with my mouth open, trying to figure out what the hell I was watching. She mentioned that, from the camera's perspective, I was standing there and doing nothing for almost an hour. I shook my head and told her that there was a man there, that the man had walked into the store and that he wanted coffee. I described him to a T. I told her about how awkward it was, how he wouldn't speak and just pointed to the coffee, how he just sat there and he wouldn't acknowledge me when I spoke. I nearly broke down into tears, because this video was making me look like an absolute maniac. I was stammering and pleading with her to believe me that there was a man that walked in, and that I wouldn't have put a coffee cup on the counter and wasted time, or went to talk to an empty chair like that unless there was someone there. Thankfully, Shelley was a very understanding person, and she once again asked me if I was feeling okay, if I'd had any issues with anything lately, or how I was feeling that night before. I told her that I was fine, that there was nothing wrong, and that I did not hallucinate him. She nodded and agreed with me, saying that she believed me. Not sure that she fully did, but to be honest, I wouldn't either. She just told me to be a bit more assertive with asking people to leave from then on, and to go see a doctor if I started to feel that anything was off, or if anything like this happened again. I told her that I would, and she told me that she had covered my shift for that night, so I needed to go ahead and go home and relax, then come in tomorrow and that we would just move on from there. This was seriously scary for me, because I know 100% that I did not hallucinate that man. I did not hallucinate this guy coming in and drinking his coffee, but yet the video footage showed otherwise. Thankfully, it never happened again, and Shelley did not bring it up after that, because I would have hated for it to become a constant thing, or to be reminded of it. I worked at that shop until Shelley passed away, about 5 years ago, from cancer. And when she passed away, the store closed for good. So, really, I'm not sure if this was all in my head, but I don't think it was. I also don't know if it was some kind of spirit or something, but it was real for me. Way too real to have all just been a figment of my imagination. As a child, the holidays were always filled with family, love, and fun. We all gathered at my Aunt Lisa and Uncle Scott's house, and some of us were there early the day of Thanksgiving, and the last ones to leave. We had some folks that would trickle in here and there just to stop by for a bit before they had to go to another family member's home. We typically showed up around noon, as my mom would make a few side dishes at home, and then I would be tasked with making sure the box of containers didn't spill in the back seat. I loved going over there because she was my favorite aunt. My Aunt Lisa was my dad's sister, and she was very eccentric, is the best way to put it. As more family showed up, I was excited when I saw my Uncle Todd arrive. He was my dad's youngest brother, and while I loved all of my other family members, he was a top-tier uncle. He was always known for his playful antics, cheesy jokes, and the way that he could effortlessly become the life of the party. But the Thanksgiving of 2001 would, unfortunately, change how I felt about Uncle Todd. Everyone started showing up and testing out the side dishes while my grandma and Aunt Lisa would shoo everyone away. There were a few of us kids playing in the yard, keeping ourselves entertained. Even when it came time for dinner, it went as well as any other family dinner. Later that night, those of us who were still there were relaxing and trying not to pass out from food comas. A lot of my cousins had already left, but one of my older cousins was in their room. She was Aunt Lisa and Uncle Scott's daughter. A few of my younger cousins were either playing together or were asleep on the couch. So, I'd been sitting on the floor watching TV. While I was sitting there, my Uncle Todd came into the room and asked me what I was watching. I excitedly told him about the show, and as kids often do, I had to explain the whole plot of the story and the characters. I watched him as I talked and could see his demeanor was different than what I was used to. He seemed somber, and his smile kind of felt forced. I asked him if he was okay, not knowing what else to do, and he smiled at me and said, "Yeah, of course, buddy. Hey, why don't you come with me? We need to run to the store real quick. Your mom asked me to pick up something." Again, I loved my Uncle Todd, and I thought going for a quick ride with him would be fun. I still had my shoes on, but it had been cold outside, so I walked towards the corridor to get my jacket, but my uncle stopped me saying that I wasn't going to need it. He assured me that I could stay in the car in the heat when he got out. I thought that made sense, so when he motioned to go out the back door, located in the living room that I was in, I happily skipped out the door with him. The car ride started off normal enough. Uncle Todd asked me about school and my friends as we drove through the neighborhood. But as we turned onto the ramp to the highway, his tone and question trailed off, and I became curious as to where we were going. We didn't live far from my aunt and uncle's place, so I knew of at least one store that was close enough that we didn't need to take the highway. It was silent for probably a few seconds, but it became pretty awkward. I kept looking over at him and noticed how hard he was gripping the steering wheel while staring straight ahead. Then, without warning, Uncle Todd let out a wail and started to cry, causing me to jump. "You're lucky, you know," he said between his sobs. "You've got so much time ahead of you. So much time to decide what to do with your life. So much time to fix all your mistakes." His words confused me, especially as they were met with tears. I could feel the car was speeding up, going down the nearly empty highway, and I started to become terrified as well. As I felt the car shake from the speed, my uncle talked about missed opportunities, all of his unfulfilled dreams, and feeling trapped in a life that he never wanted. I could feel this huge sense of sadness looming over my uncle, and while I was now in tears from being terrified, I also found myself crying with him. Suddenly, Uncle Todd began yelling. I could just keep going, you know? I could drive off an embankment, no one could stop me. No one would have to feel sorry for me, and you would never have to experience this crushing reality of this hell that we call life. I didn't understand any of this, and I was terrified. Uncle Todd was always so full of life and happiness. I only ever saw people show him love, including myself. Why did he seem so sad now? Why was he saying all of these things? I was young enough to not understand what was happening, but old enough to know that if something didn't change, we could both die. I choked back tears and finally found my voice enough to say, I love you, Uncle Todd, no matter what." He kept looking over at me, taking these deep breaths, and after a heavy sigh, I felt the speed of the car start to decrease. He continued to sob, but it slowed down little by little, along with the car. He got off the highway and took the back roads in silence. He sniffled a few times, but that was all the sound that was being made inside the car. As we pulled back into the house, he looked at me, patted me on the shoulder, and said that he was sorry. He motioned for me to go ahead and get out, and I slowly hopped out, waiting for him to follow. But he stayed sitting in the driver's seat with the car off. Shortly after I got out, the scene became pretty chaotic. My mom came running outside. Her face was red and streaked with tears. She instantly grabbed me in a hug, telling me that I was okay, that I was safe. Everyone else was now outside, and several of my family members were shouting at Uncle Todd angrily. I was scared and relieved to be home, but all I could think about was my uncle. I shouted back at them to leave him alone, and they all looked back and forth between me and my uncle. Before I could really comprehend everything, the red and blue lights showed up, and my uncle was forcibly pulled out of the car. I became even more scared for my uncle as no one would listen to me, nor ask me what happened, and I felt like he was being looked at as a bad guy. But even though I was scared and I knew what he said, I couldn't bring myself to be mad at him like everyone else seemed to be. I didn't see Uncle Todd for a long time after that, even though I asked about him pretty frequently. We had a party at our house, and I was ecstatic to finally see him there, and while he seemed like the happy and cheerful uncle that I knew him as, this time it was different. It felt real. He was warm and lighthearted. He was soft-spoken and just all around had that aura to him that anyone would want to be around. I was happy to have him back. It wasn't until many years later that I fully understood the depth of what had happened that day. As it may seem obvious to those of you reading this now, Uncle Todd had been battling some unseen demons and an overwhelming sense of despair that he thought he could escape from that night. One that could have ended tragically for both of us and changed our family's lives forever. Thankfully, he realized that night that he needed help. And, slowly, over the years, he found his way back to being who he wanted to be. The real Todd. And I will always be thankful for that. I don't know if it was something else that he saw or thought about, or if it was just my words that made him turn around that night, but it's something that I will never forget. This happened a couple of years ago now. I was in an extremely unhealthy relationship at the time, and after one of my partner's fits of rage, I went out for a late-night drive to clear my mind. I was 22 at the time, living in a small town in rural Alberta. Now, if you know anything about Alberta, you know that a lot of our residents are the redneck types, with huge jacked-up trucks, sporting massive aftermarket bumpers and headlights that can probably see clear to Mars. Now, I'm not a tiny girl. I grew up training in MMA, and I'm damn near 6 feet tall. But I drive a tiny silver sedan. So, me and my tiny car made our way out to the local fishing pond. It's also a bit of a lover's lane, but it was pretty much deserted at this time, aside from one other car in the parking lot. I pull in, hugging tight to the curb to put as much space as I can between myself and the other occupant of the lot. There's a chain guardrail thing to the immediate right of my car, as well as in front of me. But I wanted to keep my splotchy face to myself while I texted my best friend about the fight that I'd just had with my partner. As I'm sitting in my car, doors locked and the ignition off, I see a vehicle coming down the road. It's important to note that this parking lot is at the top of a T intersection, and there's not much to do in my hometown other than drive around aimlessly, so I don't think much of it. That is, until the vehicle pulled in behind and slightly to the left of me, blocking my vehicle in. I was still upset and borderline ready to end myself anyway, so although it freaked me out, I didn't do anything about it. I just stayed in my seat, doors locked, texting my friend. After about 20 minutes of this, what I could now tell was a massive truck with an iron cross bumper. You can look it up, they're distinctive. It's sitting behind me with its damn lights from hell shining in my car. They drove off. I paid no more attention to them, though. Once I felt calm enough to go back home, I started my car and went to put it in reverse. Remember how I said the lot that I was in was at the top of a T intersection? Well, all of a sudden these lights come on from just up the road behind me. I pull onto the crappy gravel road and start making my way back towards town, and the truck followed. I drove slowly and calmly, and they got so close behind me that they nearly clipped my car with their bumper. And they kept backing off and pulling in close again, like a cat playing with a mouse. I completely ignored them and continued to drive normally until I made it to the turn into town where they decided to finally screw off in the other direction. I've never felt that kind of fear before, nor since. I'm not really sure what was going on or what their intentions were, and I don't really care either. I used to work at a local coffee shop. It wasn't a big chain, just a small little spot in a strip mall right at the start of town. It was owned by an older couple that was always very kind. We didn't see them too often, as they had stepped back a bit and gave most control over to their son, who was also okay for the most part. I just didn't think that he quite had the leadership skills to run it on his own, but alas, that's why we had our shift leads. We also had our fair share of regulars, between the younger group of people that went to the nearby community college, as well as an older group of ladies that I believe were friends of the owner. Again, very nice ladies, but they could also get loud. Louder than the college students even. However, you have to take the good with the bad, and we also had a few of those. This story is about one of those people. I'll call her Sandra because, well, that was her real name, and quite frankly, I don't care about her privacy anyways. Sandra was always one of our regulars, unfortunately, and she even became a running joke between not only us baristas, but to some of the customers. You could see them making eye contact with us when she would walk in, or whisper to the person they were with, who would then look over at her. It was as if a dark cloud would settle over the place every time she entered. She always ordered the same thing, and while the order itself was pretty simple, she always made it worse than it needed to be, and would find the smallest thing to complain about. She ordered 2 drinks. A hot one that had to be a specific temperature or higher, and a cold one. The cold one, she always wanted 2 pumps of the fruit syrup, and 4 pumps of the cane sugar. Then she wanted us to shake it, as we normally did with our cold drinks, but she never wanted us to put the ice in the cup. If she caught even a single sliver of ice when we handed her her drink, she would lose her mind. She claimed that the cold drink was for later, so if we added ice, it would get watered down. A single ice cube isn't going to make a difference in all that sugar, but it was never worth arguing with her. Then, she also ordered the same food item. She never stayed and tried anything else, but the problem with that is that it's one of our more popular items. Because it's a small local business, a lot of the food, especially the pastries, are made from scratch in the small kitchen in the back. We have to be there a few hours before opening to make them all, and because we closed at 6, we never went back to make more. We even made extra of those compared to everything else because they are so popular, but they still sell out almost every single day. Once we were out for the day, and that was it. Most people understood this, but Sandra never did. The time that she came in wasn't consistent. She might come in close to opening one day, but then not come in until noon the next day. And when she came in at noon, chances are we were out of the lavender scones that she always got. So, the bigger problem with Sandra's order was her reaction when something would go awry. And she would become unglued and complain until one of our leads would come out, and she would demand a refund, or something for free, or a certificate. We didn't have gift cards, but we did do certs. Sandra made off with a lot of free items and certs, too. I still wonder if her whole game was to just get free stuff, and she had no humility, or if she truly was just that miserable of a person. Because I always think, if we did such a horrible job and so consistently, why would you keep going there? But it's neither here nor there, I suppose. So, now that I've introduced you to Sandra, let me tell you why she has relevance to this story. One day I was working, it was around 2 p.m., and I was doing my normal wipe down of the counters and tables when who else but Sandra would show up. I shuddered as I walked back behind the counter, because I knew today was going to be a bad day, because we were out of the scones. I put in her drink order as she mumbled it out to me, and when she mentioned the scone, I had to be the one to tell her that we were out. Cue the tantrum. Before I could say anything past, we're actually already out of those for the day, she was already demanding a manager. There was no point in trying to say anything else, so I went straight to the back to get Jamie. He came out and, already exasperated, he asked Sandra what the problem was. As she complained about the lack of food choices, Jamie cut her off, laying out her choices. Sandra, we go through this weekly with you. You know we run out of those around noon. Nothing you've ordered so far has been wrong because we haven't even made it yet. You just didn't get an item you wanted because it's sold out, not because there's something wrong with it. You can choose something else, or just be happy with your drinks, but you're not getting a refund for something you didn't even get. It may not have been verbatim of what he said, but it was pretty much that. And to be honest, it was satisfying to hear. Sandra, on the other hand, was not happy. Her face was showing it as she turned more and more red. She just ordered her drinks and walked to the end of the counter to wait. Kelsey was on the espresso machine at the time, and Jamie told her to go ahead and take her break and that he would take care of her orders, so she happily let him take over. Another customer had come in, so I rang them up as I made quick glances over at Sandra, angrily watching him like a hawk. Shortly after, I just stood back organizing and picking up the back counter, as I listened for any more complaints for Sandra. I didn't have to wait long. He made her ice drink as the espresso was pouring, so she got that first with no complaints. But as she took the hot drink, she pulled the lid off, stuck her finger in it, and then complained that it wasn't hot enough. He took it from her and remade it. Not once, not even twice, but 3 times. By the 3rd time, she did the same thing, as she made a face ready to complain again, but Jamie stopped her. He mentioned how he was not going to continue to remake it for her, as it could be dangerous with how hot it was, and that she was just being wasteful. But he didn't get to finish his sentence before Sandra splashed the hot beverage right on Jamie's face, and hitting part of my arm. The small spot that hit me made me jump because of how hot it was, but Jamie's screams told me that I got lucky. I ran over to him immediately with a towel and looked over as Sandra grabbed a straw, smiling, and slowly walked out of the store. I tried to ask Jamie if he was okay or what I should do, but his screams were awful. His screams as he collapsed on the floor were piercing, and I just didn't know what to do. I yelled for Kelsey to call an ambulance as she was already back in the lobby, presumably because she heard his screams too. One of our regular customers was there, and while I hate that they had to witness it, I'm thankful that it was her of all people. She was an old retired nurse, and she helped me with Jamie. The ambulance and the police arrived, and as they were loading Jamie up on the stretcher, I could see the giant welts on his face already forming. All of us, including our customer that stayed to help, told the police everything we witnessed. Of course, the police wanted any and all information that we could give them on Sandra, such as a physical description, but unfortunately for her, we had one better. We had a reward system, and the owners were stuck in their old-fashioned ways of snail mail. This meant that we sent out physical, local coffee shop letters as well as occasional coupons. We had Sandra's full name and full physical address on record, and we happily called up the owners and got access to provide it to them. Jamie came back after taking a few days off, but when he did return, he still had some scarring and discoloration from the burns. He even had a bit of a scare because he was having trouble seeing and he was worried that it messed up his eyesight. But luckily, it all came back perfectly fine. He just had to use some special eye drops for a while. He also informed us that the police talked to him too, and he was given the choice to press charges, which he very much did. And this also meant that she would be banned from the store. It was pretty annoying that all of this had to happen just to get her banned, but at the same time, I understand that we can't just ban someone for being a jerk. It's not how things work. But she did decide to take it too far. The thing is, Jamie explained to us that he not only wanted to make her drink so he knew they were right, but because he was actually on edge, and worried that she might try something, since he stood his ground and he was happy that it happened to him and not one of us. I was thankful that he was always so willing to look out for us. He'd always been a very protective manager of all the baristas, and is still one of my favorite managers, but those screams he let out that day were absolute nightmare fuel. I had never heard a grown man scream like that in pain, and I had no idea what to do. But he did recover with no scarring. Sandra was charged with assault, I believe, and the owners actually agreed to put up a sign warning people that if they're abusive to the staff, they will be told to leave. So, I guess that's an improvement. I just hope that Sandra's not out there bullying someone else over a simple cup of coffee.